Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Thumbs up, speakers, if you can hear me, please. Awesome. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the third installment of the Design for Inclusion webinar series. This event is hosted by Human Space, the inclusive design consultancy of Building Design Partnership, also known as BDP. My name is Rosalind Tsang. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the New York City Studio Director of BDP, a global architecture, design, and urbanism practice. Today, I have the privilege and honor of moderating an exceptional interdisciplinary panel of global experts to explore how designing for social impact creates value in the built environment. Our esteemed speakers represent the spectrum of owner and developer, the academy, government and policy, and the design profession. We are joined by Lauren Zullo, Managing Director of Impact at Jonathan Rose Companies, Marc Norman, Associate Dean at the NYU Schack Institute of Real Estate, Gigi Lee, Vice President of Government and Community Relations at New York City Economic Development Corporation, and Ossie Airewele, Residential and Mixed-Use Lead North America at BDP. Before we dive in, a few logistics. The panel will run approximately 45 minutes, and there will be a time of audience Q&A at the end. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share during today's session, please feel free to type it into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started. All right. With New York City being a global hub for business and thought leadership, it's no surprise that environmental, social, and governance, ESG, considerations have been a popular topic of discussion in much of the professional world. More than just a buzzword, ESG leads to deeper questions surrounding investor behavior, how to prioritize positive health outcomes, and what does genuine community engagement look like. Increasingly, governments at all levels, developers, institutions, and community organizations are adhering to guidelines and frameworks built around ESG targets, and more than lip service is required to meet these goals. Today, we will take a deep dive into ESG and evaluate how designing for human health and equality drives long-term value for investors and residents alike. Hello, panelists. So, I am going to kick us off with my first question. And this will be for Marc and Lauren. What aspects of social impact are you exploring in your work, and why is it important for you?
I'm happy to start. Thank you for having us today, Rosalind, and thanks to everyone for joining. As Rosalind mentioned, I'm with Jonathan Rose Companies, and we are an affordable housing owner and developer, building housing in the city of New York, as well as across the country. In fact, we just broke ground on our first West Coast affordable housing development project. And we also invest out of a number of private equity funds in the preservation of affordable housing, recognizing that existing buildings play have a huge role to play. And obviously, it can be even more impactful to preserve the housing that's existing and maintaining its affordability, rather than, or in addition to, kind of going through often lots of red tape to build new housing in New York City and elsewhere. And I wanted to mention that sort of affordability and ESG and environmental impact, social impact have been really at the ethos of our company since our founding about 30 years ago. We started with a focus on transit-oriented development. And Jonathan, our founder, likes to say he was designing to LEED standards before LEED existed. So he had always approached it through that lens. But I think increasingly we've been hearing the alarm bells of the housing crisis in the US. So for the last decade plus, we've been almost exclusively focused on affordable housing and building it, preserving it. Coupled with that, we know that the number one predictor of health is not someone's biology, not someone's lifestyle, but their physical and social environment. So it's not your biology, it's your zip code. And we understand that the homes in which people live, where they spend almost 90% of our time indoors, is really important to their health and to their opportunity in their lives. So we've created a program called Communities of Opportunity, and this is where our social impact and design for inclusion philosophies really live, is within the Communities of Opportunity program, where we utilize an asset-based community development approach to look to our residents, look to our surrounding communities to identify from them not only what are your needs, what are your wants, but also what resources can they bring to the table? What resources and assets that exist already within the community can we help flourish within the context of our buildings or the communities that we're building? So we're really excited about this prospect of preserving and creating affordable housing, but also of creating thriving communities of opportunity that help kind of rebuild the fabric of society.
Great. So I'm by training an urban planner, but worked in finance and affordable housing and community development. And now, as an academic, I think, we all have a responsibility to think about what the next generation of leaders look like. And so at NYU, I'm really happy that at NYU Schack, we've done a couple of things around ESG. One, all of our incoming graduate students in construction management, real estate development, or finance, all take an ESG course in related to commercial real estate. And what that means is they start their education with us, understanding that that's a primary factor. So being able to measure and evaluate, right, design, development, finance, and returns, I think we're all learning. It's also important to measure social impact, sustainability outcomes and other things. So I'm really proud that we have that sort of embedded in our courses. We also have a course for our undergraduate students. And then students outside of the classroom, can engage with our labs. And so the Urban Lab, the Center for the Sustainable Built Environment, our REIT Center, all try to incorporate some of those aspects of ESG into their research and their seminars and into our conferences as well. So, my hope is that the students will come out both with an understanding of the real estate field, the built environment, but also, some of the headwinds we face and how we can innovate in trying to solve some of those problems.
Thank you, Lauren and Marc. That's really great. I really love how you spoke about equipping our students for the future, Marc, and how NYU has framed the curricula to incorporate ESG, and then how in practice, Lauren and Jonathan Rose and companies have really embedded their ethos into communities of opportunity. So I'd really love to explore how perhaps Ossie and Gigi, you can touch upon how you are contributing to the realization of inclusive communities in your spheres.
I can start. So I think the Building Design Partnership, BDP, the partnership speaks to our philosophy and ethos, around collaboration as a multidisciplinary design, engineering, and urbanist firm. Architecture design really responds to solving problems and addressing needs. And it's important to be able to invest time to really understand the site, the community, cultural and client needs. Working with our consultancy, Human Space, we have the expertise in inclusion, accessibility, and wellness. We're given the opportunity to gain a much deeper understanding of what the needs and challenges are to inform an appropriate design response with an enhanced focus on inclusive communities. Just to speak to Lauren's point, I think one of the values of being able to go a little bit deeper is that you're able to frame the perspective of your response not to the net area of the development that forms a site boundary, but also the strengths and qualities of the adjacent communities and how they contribute to a more nuanced brief. So to be able to approach a project thinking beyond the adjacencies of your site boundary is really valuable, because adjacent communities are infected by every development. Sometimes they can help to reinforce what you intend to do on the site, and sometimes your site can help to reinforce the deficiencies. So thinking beyond site boundaries is essential and really important part of what we like to do and understand before we put pen to paper.
Great, happy to round out the first question. So thank you, Rosalind, for putting this panel together. For those who are joining today that are not familiar with NYC EDC, we are a nonprofit, but we're also a semi-government agency. We're one of the few agencies that actually builds things. My background really intersected with EDC when I was on my local Lower Manhattan Community Board for 10 years and worked closely with the city on Essex Crossing, which is just by the base of the Williamsburg Bridge, a 10-year construction project, which when approved under Mayor Bloomberg in 2012 was really historic in that it guaranteed 50% affordable housing in perpetuity and had one of the most inclusive community engagement processes really to date for a project that was 9 vacant city lots that had been vacant for, I believe, over 60 years, right, in the Lower East Side. And it really gave me a framework in which to approach sort of government work on how community, if engaged even before design and being part of design, can really shape the future of a neighborhood in pushing through things like wanting to include family-friendly amenities, wanting to include a school, a certain amount of open space, limiting the square footage of big box stores that will come into an area, making sure there's a grocery store, right? And so determining the income bands and the breakdown of the percentage of income bands for the affordable housing, and even something as simple as requiring the developer that would eventually be awarded the RFP to build the affordable units first, right, and not to leave them to the end, right? And so these are all things that that since then joining the city council as a chief of staff for a council member, and then now in government and community relations at EDC, that experience is something that I take with me, because the power of engaging locally and in a very honest and open and transparent way is really part of the mission of EDC. And I think what's really exciting about EDC is that we also partner with private entities, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity here to straddle both private and public sectors, and thinking about how you interweave and the synergy between policy and quality space and design, and kind of shepherd it through what some people would call, sort of the government bureaucracy and process. And so that's sort of the lens that I bring to this conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gigi and Ossie. And that is a perfect segue into what the next section of discussion I'd like us to embark on is the quality of space. And how do you design for health and inclusion? Particularly, we've spoken a lot about affordable housing here and the importance of that. In the housing and mixed use sector, what are some of the key considerations? And how do you go beyond baseline requirements?
I'm happy to jump in on that. So being in the affordable housing space and almost always relying on government funding somewhere in the capital stack, our design is heavily regulated, and we have quite a few requirements around lots of sort of specific design elements of the space, and we're always happy to take those on. And we like to think a lot about how do we make the homes that we build homes that we'd be happy to live in, that we'd like to have our mother live in. We like to take that lens to the work that we do. And so as we look to optimize our projects for kind of becoming these welcoming homes, welcoming communities, we do think about integrating health throughout the design process. And I think we have a couple areas where we really shine and can take it beyond the units themselves or the baseline requirements. Much of this comes through in our community facilities, where we spend a lot of time and attention kind of focused on the design and looking to our community to provide feedback on what they'd like to see come to life. So in our community facilities or our amenity spaces, we often include a fitness center. We design health and wellness rooms, often just kind of small private areas where that can serve the purpose for private consultation as our health partners come in and can conduct health exams periodically for our residents. We host vaccination clinics and more, utilizing spaces such as that. We also consider our community rooms to be sort of the lifeblood through which our communities thrive. So we equip our often large community spaces with an open communal kitchen, configurable seating so that we can accommodate any type of event. We increasingly come to know that things like that often aren't glamorous, things like storage, are really important because they can help eliminate the clutter or the holiday decorations that kind of need to be behind the scenes, but help bring joy at certain times of the year. And so we've really kind of focused on not only the community building spaces, but also the functional spaces needed to support that. Some of our cooler or more innovative ideas that we've implemented recently include a community or kind of a lending library type concept. And in that, it's especially in our projects in New York City where everyone's space is so constrained, we may have a full set of dining plates in there, something that you maybe only need when you have company and don't need day to day, or a vacuum, a ladder, all of those little items that you wish you had, but you just don't have the storage space for. So we have this kind of lending library program that's been really popular. And the other features that we like are our outdoor spaces. And this is where we are always working with our community to co-create the ideas of how those spaces get programmed. Over the years, I could list, hundreds of things and different ideas that we've had because we take that community-based approach. But we've built walking trails, outdoor exercise equipment, contemplative paths, or tree groves kind of planted in a certain pattern to make sort of meditative strolling make sense, but always accessible with ramps and usable to people with any sort of ambulatory device. And we really find those areas to be a huge opportunity for us to, I think, not only engage the community in how they're programmed, but it also just makes a lot of sense from a design perspective to focus on the outdoor spaces in the timeline, because we often early in a project we may not have all of the right people at the table yet. There may be residents who haven't been identified yet, like that. But as you get further into the project, there's often room to create some last minute changes potentially in the outdoor spaces as well. So even if you think you're too late to the co-creation or community input game, I would say focus on your outdoor spaces, and you can probably find a way to incorporate feedback there as well.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. I really love that you actually get the feedback from the community to then continue to inform your spaces. And that lending library, that's brilliant. So anything, do any of the other panelists want to add to that? How you design for health and inclusion, and how you can go beyond baseline?
I wouldn't mind adding to that. Sorry.
Great.
I thought Gigi might have mentioned something.
Go ahead.
I wouldn't mind into that. I don't think Lauren's left me a lot to say. I think it speaks to the power and the process of Jonathan Rose and how well connected they are to the communities and understanding the programming of spaces there. That was a very detailed and amazing run through of programming of indoor and outdoor spaces. I'm just going to take a quick helicopter view from the point of view of health and this idea that, you know, creating more walkable cities and a varied mix of uses, which you've spoken to, Laura and Ossie, is very important for reducing dependency on the car, reducing pollution, and better public transit, which, you know, from, you know, specific design and planning perspective is really important move to address issues around urban health as it relates to the quality of air and the environment that people sort of live, play, and breathe in. But with regards to inclusion, you know, clearly there are baseline requirements. So the A, lead, well, fit well, they all speak specifically to those aspects of inclusion. And there's plenty, you know, ways that we can design for inclusion, and Lauren has extensively gone through how we can do that. But for me, I think that the creation of spaces that are welcoming, the creation of spaces that are welcoming and overcome barriers of the feeling of exclusion is also another important aspect of how I think we should measure the quality of the spaces beyond, you know, aesthetic, functional, and sort of technical merits. And I think, you know, this goes back to community engagement, the importance of the process to encourage and include diverse people and cultures that can help to create a sense of belonging and overcome the potential for a feeling of exclusion when the project is eventually realized. So from having people engaged at the design stage and from them understanding, being able to visualize themselves in that space once that space or once that building's finished, are kind of really important cues for them to feel like they can use the shared spaces when they're complete. So just wanted to add that lens to it and the values of engagement to enable beyond just, again, the site boundary, but the community beyond.
That's right. You hit upon a really good point, Ossie, and there's all of these reporting frameworks, there's LEED, there's WELL, but over and above that, it really should be more than just ticking a box to get your certification, but really thinking about how you can create communities of that are welcoming and encourage people to participate. What about from a research lens? Are there any factors, Marc, perhaps in your sphere, that can influence positive social impact within communities?
You know, I think some of the things that I'm doing are still in process, but I think are showing hopeful signs. So, you know, one of the things that I think we do when we look at redevelopment and we look at community engagement is, you know, so think about how much affordable housing, right? Or how much open space. And we usually do it in terms of percentages, right? Like, can it be 50% affordable? Can it be 30% affordable? And what's the impact of that? And I feel like lately my research and some of the work I've been doing is more around agency and how much agency, you know, people have when their environment is changing or when an environment's being created. And so I've been really interested in thinking about the sort of cycle of a development. So, you know, when are people engaged and how are they engaged and how do they stay, you know, involved and also active in the planning and design. And so, I, you know, sometimes that to me means we have to do a little more work behind the scenes before anything starts to say, you know, where are the existing jobs? Who are the existing contractors? What are the supply chains and how do we insert people into the supply chains? And that might lead to discussions about, is affordability the most important thing, or is it the ability for, you know, small contractors or others in the local community to participate, right? Because you might be able to build wealth both ways, but those two things might be a little bit incompatible and you might have to reconcile them. So I think it's really interesting from a research perspective to definitely think about the affordability, but also to think about, you know, what it looks like to have participation in all aspects of the development. So what does that mean? That might mean that, you know, the big national management company will do a good job in the 200 unit development, but, you know, having 17 fourplexes with local managers and rental units that are that also have owner occupancy might also create benefits in a different way. So I think you can't do that necessarily with every development. Sometimes you want that scale, but I think to think through many different aspects, beyond just affordability, is important. I think you get some of those answers from the community engagement about sort of what people want, what people's desires are. And I think, there are more developments that are kind of looking at that. And I think part of that, might be evidenced in a community benefits agreement. But other parts of it might be a more organic conversation, before the RFP goes out or before the development opportunity exists. I think that's an exciting sort of like direction I see, certain developments, projects, cities and communities taking.
So I would love to just kind of give an on the ground color, right, to Marc's kind of academic approach, which is, for almost all of EDC's major projects, understanding that they impact communities very directly, we have and form community advisory boards, stakeholder groups that are a combination of residents, elected officials, local businesses, stakeholders, because we do understand and value the very on the ground experience of individuals that have made the neighborhood the desirable neighborhood that we all want to build in, right? But I think the reality is engagement is not like a neat process. It is not a linear process, and often neighbors and friends disagree on how much affordable housing there should be. Do we prioritize mixed use versus just housing, especially given the housing crisis that the city is in now, right? And so some of the trends that we see between all of the different boroughs and all of the different projects are really also focused on some of the, I would call sort of the softer issues, which are like, are we developing in places where it's like a single transportation mode, or are we developing where you have to take the subway and then a bus and then walk another 5 blocks? Where's the nearest hospital? Where's the nearest school? We want vibrant streetscapes, right? We want a commercial area nearby, with the transition of working from home post-COVID. People want to be able to live and work in the same neighborhood, also because of childcare, right? And so while there are, each neighborhood sort of definitely comes up with their own list of priorities, we also see some commonalities when it comes to how people conceptualize and kind of visualize quality of space in their own neighborhoods, because I think residents now also really understand that, especially with large scale developments, like you want to find that balance between finding kind of a project that is a benefit to those who have lived there for 20 or 30 years, but also understanding there's going to be a huge influx of new residents, right, which will be your neighbors, and how that changes the dynamic of your neighborhood, and how to plan for that.
It's really complex, isn't it? I really love what each of you have brought up. There's a desire for walkable cities, walkable neighborhoods, so you have access to both amenities and the services that you need. And essentially, it's building a social infrastructure so that you can have eyes on the street and look out for each other. And at the same time, as Marc raised, there's building an economic development that's appropriate for the neighborhood and stimulating local economic development so that people can actually live and work in the same place. So this is really a great transition to the next topic that I want to explore with each of you is how to work within communities and lived experiences. We've mentioned a lot of aspirational goals here, and I wonder if a couple of you could speak about some real examples in your own work of how you work with communities. Are there any developments that you can share with us, and how you've worked with communities in a meaningful way, and share with us some successes and lessons learned?
Sure, I'll start with a project of ours. We just completed the first phase of a project called Sendero Verde. It is in East Harlem, and it's when it's completed, it'll be 700 units of 100% affordable housing, with housing kind of AMI bands from up in the 130% AMI all the way down to a formerly homeless band. And so in order to design this building, we first of all won it through an RFP. We won the opportunity to build it through an RFP issued by the city. So we got a full city block of almost a full city block of undeveloped land, and we partnered with L&M developers as well as a community partner group called the Acacia Network. And Acacia really served as kind of our link to the community. Working with that community organization, they participated as developers in every owner's meeting, hand in hand, kind of making design decisions, financial decisions with us at the table as kind of more experienced real estate developers, but they were really our experienced community builders. So they kind of brought a great perspective to the table. And one thing that we really think Sendero Verde does, or will do when it's completed, is kind of brings this idea of a community of opportunity to life, in that it brings into the community itself, directly into the buildings, some of the support services that are needed. So we do have actual support services for residents, which is being provided by the Acacia Network. But into the building, we also have a charter school. We have a community group called Union Settlement that provides after-school programs and senior programming. We also have 3 community gardens located in the space, and it's really kind of we see those community groups kind of all coming together, taking collective ownership, and really excited about the development project, excited about the first residents that were moving in as of September. And I think we're really seeing this thrive, because with a community of that scale, a full city block, right, it can really kind of make or break the neighborhood around it. And so we were really conscious of ensuring that we were bringing additive support services to the neighborhood and filling the needs that were identified by our community partners.
I'm happy to talk about some city funded programs. Certainly, I mentioned Essex Crossing earlier. Not too long ago, the mayor and the governor announced an over $1 billion project in Kips Bay on the east side of Manhattan called Spark Kips Bay, which in partnership with CUNY is a city and state partnership where we're basically forming a science district where you have a lot of life sciences, as well as partnership on really an educational pathway, starting from high school, college, graduate school, with the nursing program in CUNY, and about 4 other city agencies, including the medical examiner's office, partnership with Bellevue for training simulation space that really rounds out some of the most kind of innovative and aggressive approaches to both kind of private sector job production in the healthcare and science space, which we've seen will only grow kind of given the city's experience during COVID and post-COVID, the importance of health and health training and the next multiple generations of just kind of driving students, particularly students that may have typically been left out or feel like they don't have access to that kind of training or field of work, right? So that was a very significant city and state investment. A couple weeks ago, there was an announcement in Queens in Willits about a privately funded soccer stadium, but with that over 2,000 units of affordable housing that will literally transform an area that was really more manufacturing, right? And really like using all possible space to think about housing and economic development. So, I think the city is looking very aggressively at opportunities, both large and small, to really make a dent in this affordable housing crisis that we're seeing in this city. And so those are just two recent examples of projects that EDC has spent a lot of time working on. And we have another one in the Bronx, which is transforming Kingsbridge Armory, which is the largest armory in the country, and we just started our community engagement process to think about how to use, this enormous space that has been vacant for a while. So, a lot of exciting things going on.
That's fantastic. You're getting me all riled up here, Gigi. I love how you talked about the city, the importance of city and state investment, and essentially partnering with the public sector, or the private sector rather. It really is important to bring the two sides together to deliver something over and above and really address communities. And then Lauren, how you talked about collective ownership models and really boots on the ground community engagement. So I do want to also get the perspective of Ossie as a design professional. How have you responded to some of the lived experiences in your work? And some of the conversation going on here around public-private partnerships and the involvement of city and from the private sector as well.
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that. I think in terms of formative experience, my earliest real experience of engaging the community actually goes back to a time in North London. And that was actually also layered with city mapped based data, so like GIS data. So you get the perspective of the community perspective on the ground, but also the overlay of the GIS trends and what that is telling you. And I think that was quite a helpful bit of experience to inform a piece of work that we recently did with or have done with our innovation team at BDP and Human Space, where we interested in how we could activate underutilized and vacant sites via meanwhile use. The idea is that the flexible, adaptable structures, could bring much needed services and amenities to community, but bring it quickly whilst the development is being planned and in transition to a point where it gets its consents. But we also think it could help to improve urban health outcomes and generate income streams to stimulate local spend. So while that site still being sat vacant, it could actually be active and generate local income. Obviously, this is going to be to some extent dependent on the planning processes to enable that to happen, so temporary use. But also to provide positive connections between the developer, landowners, investors, but with the communities and stakeholders, all the things that Gigi were referring to earlier. I think this particular point is essential though, because again, to Gigi's point, it helps to build trust, and trust is really the legacy of, you know, a legacy that leads to a positive outcome of a project. It can lead to faster consents. It can lead to the vibrancy of a development once it's finished, because the trust reaches a critical mass where you go from, should we say, a slightly NIMBY approach to excitement about it actually being delivered. So one of the other things we were pretty interested in this piece of work was actually the Interborough Express, you know, as a catalyst for improving neighborhoods in East New York, as well as its potential for addressing some of the sort of key factors that contribute to poor urban health, such as, you know, poor transit, which leads to over-dependence on the car, which in turn leads to, you know, issues around poor air quality, as I mentioned earlier. So one of the things we did is that by analyzing the data mapping, but also extending the community conversation experience of London into local community groups in East New York. So we spoke with East New York Restoration and United Community Centers. What we found interesting is when we overlay the two things, we found that actually there was quite a lot of alignment in terms of what was needed from the World Health Organization's sort of 5 pillars of urban health. And so streetscape design, hubs for social interaction, access to healthy food, environmental comfort, and preventative healthcare. You know, the kind of excellent themes that helped for us to kind of understand where our perspective might be and how we look at a meanwhile use in a hypothetical site in East New York. I think we're pretty close to publishing the study. We've gone through a number of iterations and names, but I think the current name we're leading with is Regeneration. And we're really excited about the potential really to take it from a hypothetical position into one that is real. And we're certainly hoping that, you know, developers, landowners, investors might be interested in that too. Just one other thing to mention, which is going back to sort of more recent UK reference that we've been involved in BDP. This isn't really, the meanwhile concept is not a theoretical one, it is real. You know, we have similar and successful precedents in the UK. And we've been recently involved with the Box Park development, first of which was in London. And I know from the success of that as a meanwhile interim use that supports independent retailers, it's been so successful through the integration of a strong leisure focus. It actually transcended that initial meanwhile use site and is becoming a bit of a program that we're exploring on wider sites, because we can see the value and the client can see the value in how it not only strengthens local retail, but also strengthens the community through its leisure offer as well. So we're excited about that experience, and we hope to be able to translate that into a New York setting, with East New York being a particular focus as it relates to the Interborough Express.
Thank you, Ossie. So everyone stay tuned for that launch. And just to clarify for the audience here, we're using meanwhile use, interim use interchangeably in terms of how we can activate vacant sites for the benefit of the community. So hopefully we have now a lot of great precedents from Sendero Verde to Essex Crossing to Kingsbridge Armory of how we can really approach developments in a more holistic and socially responsible way. And at this point in the conversation, I'd like to talk a little bit about sentiments of the capital and investor markets and how ESG can build long-term value. So perhaps Marc, might you kick it off with just talking a little bit about what you feel is the general sentiment in capital markets, and can social impact drive investor optimism? Do accreditations help?
You know, I've been working on a project around how ESG becomes, like, especially in municipal bond issuances, like how do you actually measure that outcome? How do you measure that impact? And the conversations have been really interesting among, you know, municipal issuers, bond buyers, and others about how strict you should be or should you kind of like have a kind of flexibility because, different situations are different, right? Like, how do you measure ESG in a water sewer bond? And, do you, and in a housing bond, does the buyer matter? And, are you adding costs if you're adding regulation or compliance onto it in an ongoing way? And should that compliance be, in some other angle, right? So should it be, let's say if it's a housing voucher project or a tax credit project, should that have the burden of compliance and how you measure? So I think it's still a little bit up in the air about how we measure, but I think it's very clear that many entities want to understand that there is an environmental, social, or governance aspect to their work. And I think that's good. And I think that's a change. I mean, we should also acknowledge there's also a backlash. And so there's some states, right, that are trying to limit the wording and the impact of that. And that's a sad development to me. But I think overall, it's really, at the end of the day, it's the investors, and they're the ones calling for this now. And there's an expectation, that you're not doing environmental harm, that you're trying to solve some social issues. And I like your notion of optimism, because it's not just a financial return, right? If we don't get this stuff done, right, we don't have a workforce. If we want people to come back to the office, but they have 2-hour commutes because the housing isn't affordable in the city, right? Like that all has an impact. So my optimistic take is that, people are realizing that, for example, something like affordable housing isn't just, something we should have, but something that's crucial, right, to getting, a workforce that's productive and sustainable, or, to get diversity, of uses into our cities. And so I would hope that's the case. I'm also, really excited about the innovations, the kind of fintech and prop tech innovations that allow a greater number of people to enter this space. Whether it be being able to make small dollar investments in local businesses or in housing, right? Ownership is becoming, I think, harder and harder. Home ownership in the traditional American sense is becoming harder, but people are looking at the ways that you might have an ownership interest. So be able to gain, some wealth and have an asset, even if, and maybe that's on the path to home ownership. But it gives you a stake, right? In other ways, right? If you own shares or own stock or are part of an investment, you also have a say, right? That's a vote to a certain extent. So I like seeing some of the ways people are innovating. I haven't seen anything that's really like taken off. But I think they're just, like hundreds of examples of people trying to think about what more democratized investment looks like. So that makes me happy.
I think that's a really great point, Marc. I love that there's a lot of innovation and thinking about really how do we do this? How do we get investors excited about it and willing to invest? And I was just wondering, from more of a developer owner point of view, Lauren, from Jonathan Rose and Company's experience, what have you done from an owner and developer point of view to drive investor optimism?
Yeah, I think despite the headlines and those pushing for this to become a partisan issue, I think we've really kind of continued to see growth in the ESG and impact investing space, tremendous growth actually. And we hear from our investors that, sometimes they feel as if there's not even enough product to invest in, right? And they're looking for more and more funds. So we've found it to be a real business opportunity to differentiate ourselves as an impact investor, and to be able to attract those types of institutional or impact-oriented asset owners, endowments, pension funds, and the like. So foundations are really kind of looking at this as well. And so we found it to be a big business opportunity, and obviously aligned with our mission and our vision. What it's really meant, though, I think, is kind of with the rise, with more and more funds flowing to this, we're also seeing increased regulatory scrutiny and oversight on ESG claims. And so what we're doing is really working to get our house in order, I'd say, in advance of regulations coming from the SEC, regulations that have already been put in place in Europe. And even though we're a US company and only have investments in the US, if we have European investors, then we are subject to those regulations. So it's really becoming a global market. And what's interesting is, I think, environmental characteristics have kind of long been fairly well defined in the US and globally. But social characteristics, and much of what we've talked about today, we all know from practices, it's hard to quantify, it can be hard to measure. And so I think that's one of the areas where we're seeing a lot of claims floating around out there, and just not a lot of frameworks, benchmarks, et cetera, to kind of back these up. And so that's an area where we're focused. And I would say, actually, this is separate from our business line, but we have an affiliated nonprofit that's received a research grant to work with several schools of public health to kind of evaluate what are the impacts of some of the social the social interventions that we undertake. And so I think, that's something we're trying to measure and more clearly define is, how we're seeing kind of positive health outcomes, positive financial outcomes for our residents and for our properties as well. So I think there's still a lot of research to be done in that space, and a lot of industry cohesion that can happen around kind of social characteristics.
And the important thing is that it actually is happening. There's a lot of research and innovation and thought leadership with regards to this topic. But in fact, Jonathan Rose and Companies has indeed created equity investment programs, and they have successfully preserved affordable housing. So thank you for that, and thank you for being a leader in that realm. I just looked at the time, and we need to, unfortunately, wrap up the conversation. I've had a lot of fun, so let's do a lightning round, and maybe we'll get to a question. But let's do a final lightning round with each of you, and let's talk about the future. So my final question for all of you is: where are we headed? What's the future of designing for social impact and the role of ESG? Anybody start?
I'm happy to start. So I think I would be remiss if I didn't bring the government and community relations part of my title into this conversation, right? I think that this administration is really taking a close look at some of the policies that will attract more investment, will allow more flexibility. An example, I post-COVID, there has to be a lot of kind of realigning and reassessing of, whether some of the previous business models and investor models, particularly around commercial space and business space, right? Densely populated in Midtown Manhattan makes sense. Can we use some of those vacant spaces and convert them? And how easily can they be converted into multi-use or residential, right? And to make Midtown potentially, more of a residential destination, and what are the amenities that need to accompany that, right? And so Office Anchor Strategies is a program where we are looking at, where can we locate government agencies that come with a very set number of city employees, where they will go to the local businesses, buy lunch, travel. Potentially they don't have to travel into Manhattan, but can stay in the borough where they live, and use a placement of a city agency and their employees to really jumpstart a new business or commercial hub in the outer boroughs, right? Whether that's Staten Island, whether that's New York, Far Rockaway, Central Queens, right? And so really thinking a little bit more creatively about the siting of our investments. I think also something that's been very integral to EDC's work is also resiliency, right? After Superstorm Sandy, a lot of change around requirements and investment in resiliency, the cost, the impact, the environmental impact. And so that's something that is very important. And then I think on the government side, with the recent passage of Innovation Queens, we're seeing a new progressive city council that's not relying on council member deference, right? We're seeing council members understanding the value of larger citywide contributions to these social impact issues and really taking a new lens as to their role in ULURP, which is the Uniform Land Use Review process, right? And so I think all of these are very positive, developments that I think really lead to optimism and are showing, creativity, maybe not at the pace that Marc and the academics, want, but I think is moving the needle in the right direction.
Thank you, Gigi. Lightning round, one sentence.
Sorry.
Ossie, Lauren, Marc.
I'm gonna just build on one word that Gigi said. I like everything she said, and flexibility. We became so fixed, right? We have a business district, we have these residential districts, and that's not the history of New York. And that's not, I think, what made New York strong, although it worked, I think, for 50 years in Midtown. But I think getting back to that flexibility, whether it be in finance, in design, in planning, is I think the future that I want to see.
Great. So for me, flexibility is key. I think not just mixed use programs, but in multifamily residential buildings, also this idea that we can accommodate age in place living. Because I think we see plenty of examples in New York where communities are vastly benefiting from multi-generational neighborhoods. And then just one other thing I wanted to mention very quickly, just riffing back on what Marc was saying, is that the softer components of social infrastructure, things like nurses, teachers, first responders, social workers, they're all the things that help to make communities resilient. So if we're not able to provide affordable housing for these type of people, we're really creating less resilient communities. So I just wanted to say there that affordable housing is an issue for everyone, not just the people that can't afford a place to live. And that's me.
Absolutely. Lauren, last word.
Sure. I mean, I think we've all talked about some really great ideas here. I think there are some tensions too. So I'm really excited about what everyone's working on. And what we're starting to see is there's so much good that we want to do in terms of diverse hiring and housing affordability and home ownership models and decarbonization and electrification. And there are some tensions, right? That's a lot of money. And increasingly, seeing ESG regulatory schemes come into play. So we're excited to work collectively with our investors to find a way we can implement these grand impact visions at financial returns that are acceptable to those who really hold the purse strings and can move the economy. So we see those tensions, but we also see them as opportunity.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful way to round out the panel. And a round of applause for Ossie and Gigi and Lauren and Marc. Thank you so much for this conversation. And I'm sorry that we did not get to the audience questions, but email us and we can offline address any questions. And a quick shout out for the prior 2 episodes of Design for Inclusion webinars. They are live on demand and they can be viewed in the link in the chat. And this particular webinar today will be live on demand in a few weeks. So with that, thank you all for joining us. Thank you again for the panelists and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.